The courtroom went silent as Jasmine Crockett pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The sound of her heels echoed like a drumbeat of inevitability, each step carrying the weight of a storm about to break. In her hand was a folder, plain on the outside, explosive on the inside. Every eye in the chamber followed her as she walked with calm determination. Fixing her gaze on one man, JD Vance, he had been smiling moments before, the self-assured grin of someone convinced of his own invincibility, but now his expression flickered, the smirk faltering as Crockett's presence cut through the air like a blade. This wasn't a press conference, wasn't a debate stage. This was a battlefield where the weapons were truth, evidence, and courage. And Crockett carried all three. The whisper started in the gallery, a ripple of shock that moved like fire through dry grass. Is she really doing this? Against him now? Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, reporters' hearts raced as history unfolded in real time. The man MAGA had crowned as its heir apparent, the polished face of their new order was suddenly cornered. Betrayal hung thick in the air. Not betrayal of Crockett against him, but betrayal of Vance against the very people he claimed to represent. For years, he had sold them a story, a brand, a polished myth. But Crockett wasn't here for myths. She was here for the truth, and the truth doesn't flinch in the presence of power. She stood at the plaintiff's table, opened her folder, and the silence deepened. JD Vance leaned back in his chair, eyes darting, mask slipping. The stakes were no longer abstract. This wasn't about policy papers or talking points. It was about dignity versus deceit, authenticity versus opportunism. And the sight of Jasmine Crockett, unwavering and unafraid, told everyone in that courtroom that a reckoning had arrived. What happened next would not just embarrass JD Vance. It would not just make headlines or trend on social media. No, the confrontation now set in motion would shake the very core of MAGA, testing its foundations, its loyalty, its claim to invulnerability. And as the room held its breath, waiting for the first word, the question was no longer whether Crockett had the courage to fight. The question was, could JD Vance survive what was coming? The news hit the airwaves like lightning splitting the night sky. JD Vance, the darling of the new MAGA order, wasn't just facing criticism, he was staring down a lawsuit that threatened to unravel the very persona he had so carefully built. For years, he had been propped up as the intellectual star of the movement, the polished writer who had supposedly cracked the code of working-class America. He was their proof that MAGA wasn't just rigid, was legitimacy, strategy, and brains. But now, that star was wobbling. Exposed under the harsh light of truth because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just challenging a politician, she was challenging the mythology. She represented something MAGA could never manufacture: raw integrity. While Vance perfected the art of political reinvention, first an anti-Trump author, then a born-again disciple of the very man he once mocked, Crockett built her reputation the hard way. She didn't bow to power, she confronted it. She didn't invent a brand, she embodied a principle. And that was the contrast tearing through the headlines: the opportunist versus the fighter, the deceiver versus the truth-teller. Every network played the clips. On one side, Vance dismissing critics, dripping with condescension. On the other, Crockett sharp, unshaken, cutting through noise with precision. This wasn't just courtroom drama. It was a collision between two visions of America. One vision thrived on loyalty pledges, blind faith, and manufactured outrage. The other demanded accountability, dignity, and a refusal to accept corruption as normal. And make no mistake, corruption was the subtext here. For all of Vance's speeches about defending the heartland, questions about backroom deals and opportunistic alliances clung to him like shadows. Crockett's lawsuit didn't just name him, it forced those shadows into the light. The whispers of hypocrisy were now thunderclaps echoing through the political world. For MAGA loyalists, it was a nightmare scenario. If their intellectual heavyweight could be cornered this easily, what did that say about the foundation they had built? Was their movement truly strong, or was it a hollow shell, waiting to crack the moment someone with real conviction pressed against it? That anxiety was palpable, radiating from conservative talk shows. From uneasy tweets by party insiders, from the silence of those who usually rush to Vance's defense. But for progressives, immigrants, and those who had long felt pushed aside by the noise of MAGA's culture wars, Crockett's stand felt like a spark of validation. Here was someone who refused to be cowed by the myth of invincibility. Here was proof that dignity could walk into the lion's den and not just survive, dominate. And yet the lawsuit was only the beginning. The deeper you looked into the case, the uglier it got. Hidden contradictions, damning quotes. The paper trail of opportunism, all of it, began to surface, threatening not just JD Vance's image, but the entire facade of the movement propping him up. This wasn't a skirmish. This was an earthquake, and the aftershocks were only beginning to be felt. The nation leaned in. What else would come out? What secrets had been hidden behind the smirk and the speeches? One thing was certain. Jasmine Crockett had thrown the first stone, and the cracks were spreading fast. The reckoning wasn't just coming, it was already here. Long before the cameras followed his every word, before the Senate seat and the fawning headlines from conservative media, JD Vance was a name etched into America's literary consciousness. His memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, stormed bestseller lists and was hailed as a cultural Rosetta Stone, a book that promised to explain the forgotten corners of working-class white America. The media cast him as a truth-teller, a voice that could decode the grievances simmering across the Rust Belt. For a moment, he was the darling of liberal talk shows and intellectual panels, celebrated as a moderate who could translate pain into prose. But hidden inside, that rise was an ambition far sharper than the book jacket suggested. Because even then, Vance wasn't just telling a story. He was building a brand. And brands are malleable. They bend to opportunity. When Donald Trump stormed onto the political scene, Vance was scathing. He called Trump reprehensible, a cultural heroine. He mocked the movement, derided its excesses, and made no secret of his disdain. For a time, he wore the badge of a critic proudly, the bookish conservative who wouldn't bow to populist rage. To the political world, he seemed like the rare Republican willing to stand apart. But ambition doesn't rest easily in the shadows. As MAGA cemented itself as the party's dominant force, something in Vance shifted. The man who once warned of Trump's danger began to study his strength. Slowly, carefully, he recalibrated. The critiques softened. The denunciations vanished. And then came the pivotal, full-throated embrace of the very movement he had once dismissed as toxic. That 180-degree turn wasn't a quiet evolution. It was a spectacle. The memoirist who once dined with elites now swaggered onto rally stages. Railing against the same media that had elevated him, he echoed MAGA's talking points with practiced ease, each speech smoother than the last, each insult more barbed. The crowds cheered, the donors opened their wallets, and the bookish critic was reborn as a loyal soldier. But in that rebirth, something fundamental was lost. Authenticity. The contrast between the man on the page and the man on the stage was jarring. Critics called him a sellout. Former allies shook their heads, and yet Vance brushed it all aside with the smugness of someone who believed the gamble was worth it. He dismissed his detractors as jealous, out of touch, or irrelevant. "The world has changed," he would say, "and so have I." It was opportunism masquerading as transformation. The earnestness that once defined him had been replaced with calculation. Every insult lobbed at journalists, every dog whistle line about elites, every smirk on the Senate floor, it all carried the air of a man who thought he'd gamed the system, who believed he could rewrite his own contradictions faster than the public could notice. And for a while it worked. MAGA welcomed him with open arms. Trump himself embraced the about-face, praising Vance as a convert with zeal. Suddenly, the man once branded a never-Trumper was seated at the table of power, basking in the glow of a movement that thrived on loyalty above all else. Yet beneath that glow, the cracks were visible to anyone willing to look closely. The quotes from his past didn't vanish. The videos of his denunciations still lingered online. The sense of arrogance of a man who thought he could erase yesterday with the soundbite of today never quite left him. He carried himself with the confidence of someone untouchable, brushing off questions with a condescending chuckle, waving away criticism as if it were beneath him. To his supporters, that smugness looked like strength. To his opponents, it was a mask that begged to be ripped away. And that was exactly what Jasmine Crockett prepared to do. She knew his contradictions weren't just footnotes, they were vulnerabilities. The man MAGA touted as its intellectual star was, in truth, a tower built on sand. Every pivot, every betrayal of principle, every smirk at a journalist's question it, all added up to a pattern Crockett could expose. The public saw JD Vance as a polished fighter, the face of a movement that prized loyalty above all. But Crockett saw something else, a man who had already betrayed himself long before he betrayed anyone else. And she understood a truth his followers refused to admit. When someone sells their authenticity for power, the bill always comes due. The only question left was who would deliver it. But Crockett knew where the cracks weren't. She was about to split them wide open. Before Jasmine Crockett's name ever flashed across cable news chevrons, before her sharp one-liners ricocheted across social media, she was a fighter forged in places where power rarely bothered to look. Raised in a world that didn't hand her shortcuts or safety nets. Crockett's story wasn't curated in a publishing house or refined on think tank stages. It was lived in classrooms that didn't expect her to excel. In communities overlooked by politicians who preferred sound bites over service. And in courtrooms where dignity had to be defended case by case. Her early career as a public defender told you everything about her priorities. While others chased prestige, Crockett chased justice. She took on clients who had no one else, standing in the gap for people whose voices were too easily silenced. It wasn't glamorous work. It was exhausting, underfunded, and often thankless. But it sharpened her, teaching her to fight with precision, to see through bluster, to understand that the truth, once spoken with clarity, can pierce through the thickest armor of arrogance. This was the grit that defined her long before Congress knew her name. She wasn't groomed by political dynasties or backed by billionaires. She rose because she refused to back down. Every obstacle only added fuel to her fire. When critics mocked her, she sharpened her words. When they underestimated her, she doubled her preparation. And when they tried to silence her, she raised her voice higher, not in anger, but in certainty. By the time she arrived on the national stage, she already carried a reputation as someone who didn't just debate, she dismantled. Her sharp wit was legendary. In hearings, she could slice through hours of posturing with a single line that left her opponent stammering. On panels, she didn't need to shout to dominate. Her calm clarity made arrogance look small. Time and again, clips of her takedowns went viral, racking up millions of views from people who saw in her not just a politician, but a fighter who carried their own frustrations into the halls of power. And it wasn't just style, it was substance. Her record was proof. She championed civil rights, fought for working families, defended immigrant communities, and refused to let injustice pass unchecked. She carried herself not as someone entitled to the microphone, but as someone who had fought tooth and nail to get close enough to speak. Her voice didn't carry the weight of privilege, it carried the weight of survival, of persistence, of refusing to let her community's dignity be written off, in an era where politics is too often a theater of empty gestures. Crockett embodied authenticity. You didn't have to agree with her on every issue to respect that she meant every word she said. That rare quality truth spoken without apology was precisely why her rise unnerved those who depended on spin. Contrast her with JD Vance, and the story wrote itself. While he pivoted with the winds of opportunity, she planted her feet. While he rehearsed lines for whichever audience promised him the biggest payoff, she spoke to the people who had been ignored, whether the cameras were rolling or not. He traded his principles for power. She sharpened hers into a weapon. He carried smugness. She carried fire. Her authenticity became her shield and her sword. When detractors tried to belittle her, she turned their dismissals into moments of triumph. When they attempted to rattle her, she smiled and struck back with words so precise they echoed long after the cameras stopped. Her comebacks weren't cheap applause lines. They were lessons in refusing to be diminished. And perhaps that's why. When she stepped into the courtroom with a lawsuit that threatened to corner JD Vance, the symbolism was undeniable. This wasn't just a legal filing. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent refusing to bow to arrogance. She had walked into rooms where she was never meant to belong and left those rooms changed. She had carried the hopes of communities long told to stay silent and turned them into thunder that could not be ignored. She wasn't supposed to rise this far, the critics whispered. But dignity has a way of finding a microphone. And when Crockett spoke, the world listened not because she demanded attention, but because she embodied something too rare in American politics: authenticity that couldn't be bought, bent or broken. The clash was inevitable. On one side stood JD Vance, polished yet hollow, carrying the weight of a movement built on contradictions. On the other stood Jasmine Crockett, sharpened by struggle, carrying the strength of truth and the fire of authenticity, and when her voice collided with JD Vance's arrogance, the result would be explosive. It began like so many political clashes do not, with a bang, but with a smirk. JD Vance leaned back in his chair during a congressional hearing, the posture of someone convinced the spotlight belonged to him. He spoke slowly, almost lazily, lacing his words with the practiced disdain of a man who wanted his opponent to feel small. "Congresswoman Crockett," he drawled, "perhaps if you spent less time chasing headlines and more time understanding the real concerns of the American people, you'd have something useful to contribute." The remark hung in the air, thick with condescension. Cameras caught the grin tugging at his lips, the sideways glance to his allies who chuckled under their breath. To them, it was another easy dismissal, a reminder that power was a game they controlled. But Crockett didn't flinch. She had heard that tone before, the patronizing cadence designed to silence and belittle. And every time, she had turned it back on the speaker like a mirror reflecting their own arrogance. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Vance. Her voice didn't rise. It sharpened. "Senator, I've spent my career listening to the American people. That's why I'm here. But what you've spent your career doing is listening to yourself, rewriting your own story every time it suits you." The words landed like a thunderclap. A low murmur spread across the room. The smirk on Vance's face wavered, just for a flicker of a second, before he quickly tried to recover. He laughed, dismissive. "Ah, there it is, the soundbite for Twitter." But Crockett was already pressing forward, refusing to give him space to retreat. "You talk about the heartland, Senator? You sell yourself as its voice. But let's be honest, you've traded authenticity for applause lines. You used to call Trump a danger to America, and now you call him its savior. Which JD Vance are we supposed to believe today? The one who told the truth before, or the one chasing power now?" The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was electric. The cameras zoomed in. The smirk on Vance's face began to fade. He shifted in his seat, glancing briefly at his notes, as if the paper could rescue him. The contrast was stark. Crockett steady, precise, refusing to let his arrogance define the stage. Vance unraveling, visibly rattled by a woman he thought he could dismiss. Clips of the exchange shot across social media within hours. Headlines described it as a masterclass in composure. TikToks replayed the moment where Vance's grin slipped into uncertainty, overlaying the footage with captions like, "When the mask falls off." For progressives, it was validation. Proof that arrogance could be met with dignity, and dignity could win. And yet, this was only the beginning. Each exchange between them seemed to peel back another layer. Every time Vance tried to swat her away with smugness, Crockett found the exact words to expose the weakness beneath. It wasn't just a clash of rhetoric. It was a battle of identities. He spoke as if power was his birthright. She spoke as if truth was her duty. The difference couldn't have been clearer. By the end of the hearing, the narrative had shifted. What began as a stage for JD Vance to display his dominance ended as a stage for Jasmine Crockett to display her fire. He came in believing he could laugh her off. He left knowing she had turned his own words into chains he could not escape. The tension had escalated, past politics into something cinematic, something personal. The courtroom showdown to come no longer felt like a possibility. It felt inevitable. Because if this was what happened in a single hearing, what would happen when Crockett walked into court carrying the full weight of her lawsuit? The nation was about to find out. The morning the lawsuit dropped, Washington woke to a shockwave. Headlines blared with the kind of urgency usually reserved for war or scandal. Crockett sues Vance. 3 words that detonated across television screens, news feeds, and kitchen tables before most of America had finished its first cup of coffee. By the time the courtroom filled, the energy was electric, part trial, part theater, part national referendum. Cameras clustered outside like vultures circling for scraps. Commentators whispered about what the filing meant for the balance of power, for the credibility of MAGA, for the man who had once been sold as its intellectual anchor. Inside, the mood was taut. JD Vance sat at the defendant's table, stone-faced, jaw tight, trying to project calm but betraying flickers of unease. He straightened his tie, tapped his pen, forced a smile for the cameras. But those who knew body language saw it for what it was, a mask beginning to fracture. Then Jasmine Crockett entered. No theatrics, no grandstanding, just a slow, steady walk, folder in hand, eyes locked on the man she had come to confront. The silence that met her was almost reverent. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of inevitability, as though everyone sensed they were about to witness history turn. When she spoke, her words were measured, deliberate, each syllable a scalpel. The lawsuit laid out its case with devastating precision. Allegations of misrepresentation, conflicts of interest, documented contradictions that revealed Vance not as a principled leader, but as a man willing to reinvent himself for power. She held up exhibits like lanterns and the dark quotes from Vance's past where he had condemned Trump as dangerous, contracts that tied him to donors he claimed independence from, financial disclosures that painted a portrait of opportunism rather than authenticity. The effect was immediate. Reporters scribbled furiously. Viewers at home sat forward. Even those in the gallery shifted in their seats as if to catch every word. What had begun as a lawsuit now felt like a dismantling, a live deconstruction of the MAGA myth in the form of one man. Vance tried to interject at one point, leaning into his microphone with that familiar air of condescension. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a political stunt." But Crockett didn't even blink. She cut him off, her voice steady, her finger on the record. "If telling the truth is a stunt, Senator, then perhaps the problem isn't with the truth. Perhaps the problem is with you." Gasps. Audible gasps. The courtroom erupted in whispers before the judge's gavel restored order. But the damage was done. The moment was captured, clipped, and blasted onto social media within minutes. On TikTok, teens lips into Crockett's line over dramatic music. On Twitter, hashtags like hashtag Crockett vs. Vance and hashtag TruthBomb trended within the hour. Memes showed Vance's fading smirk juxtaposed with Crockett's fire, captioned simply, "Checkmate." The strength of her counterattack wasn't just in the facts, it was in the delivery. She never raised her voice. She never descended into the theatrics her opponent relied on. Instead, she wielded calm like a weapon, slicing through Vance's arrogance with composure that left him flailing. Each new revelation chipped away at his facade until what remained wasn't the confident senator, but a man exposed, scrambling to hold together the contradictions of his own story. And the crowd saw it. They saw his hand tremble slightly as he shuffled papers. They saw his forced laughter land flat, ignored. They saw him check his phone during recesses, only to find his mentions flooded with ridicule. The confidence that once defined him had drained away, replaced by something he couldn't disguise: doubt. Meanwhile, Crockett never wavered. Her cross-examinations were surgical, her references airtight. Every time Vance attempted to brush off a contradiction, she produced another receipt. His words from 2016 played back like ghosts haunting the chamber, reminders of a man who once claimed Trump was cultural heroin, now pretending to be the face of his legacy. She made it clear, this wasn't growth, this wasn't evolution, it was betrayal. Betrayal of principles, of supporters, of America itself. The internet exploded with reaction. Clips circulated with captions like, "Did you see that? Crockett just ended him." Instagram reels replayed his stammering alongside her piercing gaze. Late-night hosts seized on the footage, describing it as the moment the emperor realized he had no clothes. Even some conservative commentators admitted quietly, reluctantly that the damage was real, but perhaps the most devastating reactions came not from pundits, but from ordinary people. Working parents, immigrant families, young activists flooded comment sections and forums with gratitude. She's fighting for us. Finally, someone with backbone. That's the America I believe in those voices. Crockett's stand became more than a lawsuit. It became a movement by the end of the day. It was clear JD Vance had been cornered in the very arena he believed he could dominate. His arrogance had met its match, and the cracks in his armor were now gaping holes. What began as smug dismissal had collapsed into visible unease. The smirk was gone. The myth was crumbling. Still, as powerful as the courtroom scenes were, the real story was only beginning. Because the greatest shock of Crockett's lawsuit wasn't the moment she filed it, or even the revelations she delivered with unshakable clarity. No, the real shock wasn't in the courtroom. It was what happened outside the courtroom. May have fallen silent when Jasmine Crockett delivered her takedown, but outside those walls, the noise was deafening. Within minutes of the lawsuit filing and her scorching remarks, the internet erupted. Twitter was a battlefield, TikTok a highlight reel, Instagram a gallery of memes. One clip in particular, Crockett calmly cutting off JD Vance with, "Perhaps the problem isn't with the truth. Perhaps the problem is with you," spread like wildfire. It was replayed millions of times in a matter of hours. Set to dramatic music, stitched into countless videos, captioned with lines like "When you drag a phony into the daylight," hashtags like hashtag Crockett vs. Vance, hashtag truthbomb, and hashtag checkmate Crockett trended globally. Teenagers, teachers, veterans, immigrants, people from every walk of life joined in the chorus. Some memes showed Vance's faded smirk dissolving into static, while Crockett stood clear and unshaken. Others placed her words in bold, superimposed over iconic images of past American truth-tellers, suggesting she had just joined their ranks. Late-night comedians couldn't resist. Monologues opened with lines like, "JD Vance went into court with a smirk and left with a masterclass on humility," courtesy of Jasmine Crockett. Conservative talk shows fumbled, some hosts doubling down in defense of Vance, others nervously admitting the exchange had been disastrous optics. The division itself spoke volumes. MAGA's usual wall of loyalty was showing cracks. Behind closed doors, the panic was more palpable. Donors began calling staffers, asking uncomfortable questions. Is he really the future of the movement? Why wasn't this handled better? Can he recover from this? The whispers grew into rumblings. Maybe Vance wasn't the heir apparent after all. Maybe his star had risen too fast, too carelessly, too opportunistically. For MAGA loyalists, the lawsuit was a wound that couldn't be ignored. They had sold Vance as the polished intellectual, the brain to match Trump's bravado. But Crockett's strike exposed him as brittle, all veneer and no core. Supporters fractured some, doubling down in his defense, insisting it was all a witch hunt, while others went conspicuously silent. Silence, in politics, can be louder than words. Meanwhile, Crockett's supporters were galvanized. In progressive circles, she was hailed as a symbol of resilience and fire. Social media lit up with messages of gratitude. She stood up to him so we didn't have to. She's showing what courage looks like. This is how you fight for dignity, for immigrant families. Her lawsuit resonated as more than politics. It felt like vindication, a declaration that integrity could still pierce through arrogance. The press, hungry for narrative, pounced on the symbolism. The Washington Post ran a headline, "Crockett's lawsuit rocks Vance. Sends shockwaves through GOP." The New York Times framed it as a referendum on authenticity. Truth versus opportunism. Crockett forces reckoning. Even international outlets weighed in, with European papers marveling at the spectacle of a rising progressive star cornering one of MAGA's chosen heirs. And while JD Vance tried to maintain his composure in public, his every move betrayed unease. Gone was the confident swagger, replaced with carefully scripted statements and rehearsed smiles. Each time he appeared on camera, the viral clips played in the background, reminding everyone of the moment he faltered. The narrative was no longer his to control. It belonged to Crockett. The ripple effects went deeper still. Party insiders began speculating about leadership fractures. Some whispered that Vance's vulnerability could embolden rivals within his own ranks. Others worried that if MAGA's intellectual star could be undone so publicly, what did that say about the movement's durability? If the sharpest sword could be bent by a single lawsuit, was the entire arsenal weaker than they admitted? And in living rooms, offices, and classrooms across America, ordinary people asked a simpler question. Had they just witnessed the turning of a tide? For years, MAGA had presented itself as untouchable, armored in bluster and blind loyalty. But Crockett's stand cracked that illusion. Her lawsuit was more than a legal challenge, it was a cultural revelation. Proof that arrogance was not invincible, that smugness could be confronted and defeated by clarity, courage, and truth. The MAGA machine wasn't collapsing overnight, but the tremors were undeniable. And as those tremors rippled outward through donors, through supporters, through the very narrative of who held power, it became clear that the aftermath was bigger than one courtroom. Bigger than one senator, bigger even than one movement. Because if MAGA thought it was untouchable, Jasmine Crockett's lawsuit just proved otherwise. Jasmine. Crockett stood before the cameras, not as a victor basking in personal glory, but as a messenger carrying something heavier than headlines. She did not gloat, did not linger on the humiliation of JD Vance. Instead, she raised her voice to lift the story beyond herself. This isn't Jasmine Crockett versus JD Vance, she said firmly, because that would make this small. This is about truth versus lies. This is about America versus corruption. This is about whether we still believe dignity can stand in the light without bowing to arrogance. Her words were not delivered with fire for fire's sake. They were calm, steady, and anchored in something deeper. Crockett framed the lawsuit not as vengeance, but as duty. She told the watching nation that courage is not a rare commodity reserved for the powerful. It is a muscle that strengthens each time someone dares to use it. When we tell the truth, when we refuse to be silenced, we create space for others to stand too, she reminded them. Courage is contagious. And I promise you this country has more courage left in it than any cynic dares to admit. The message landed because it cut through the noise. This was not about scoring points. It was about reclaiming values many feared were slipping away. Fairness, honesty, resilience. Crockett reminded her listeners that America's story has always been one of struggle between arrogance and dignity, between those who try to hoard power and those who demand it be shared. And every time arrogance declared itself invincible, it was dignity that eventually won. She painted the lawsuit not as a personal strike, but as a reflection of the broader fight playing out in living rooms and workplaces across the nation. You don't have to be in Congress to face this choice, she said. Every family that refuses to let lies poison their dinner table, every teacher who insists on truth in their classroom, every worker who demands fairness on the job you, are part of this same story. You are proof that justice is not an idea reserved for courtrooms. It is lived every single day. In that moment, Crockett turned a political clash into a mirror for the nation. Listeners felt their own frustrations validated, their own struggles dignified. She showed that arrogance, no matter how loud, no matter how smug, always cracks when faced with clarity. And she reminded them that dignity, though quieter, carries farther because it resonates in the human heart. Her crescendo was not a scream, but a rising tide of conviction. America is not defined by those who seek to corrupt it, she said, voice firm, but by those who refuse to surrender it. Our ancestors did not endure sacrifice and build just so we could watch this country sink into lies. They handed us a promise that truth matters, that fairness matters, that justice belongs to all of us. And that promise will not die on my watch or yours. It was more than a rebuttal to Vance. It was an invocation of the American spirit. The belief that no matter how dark the moment, resilience is stronger. It was the reminder progressives craved that their fight was not in vain, that their voices were not alone, that integrity still had a place in the public square. And with that, Crockett left her audience with a final image to hold on to. This, she said, pausing for a breath that felt like the pulling back of a curtain. This is what it looks like when dignity refuses to bow. The crowd erupted, not in cheers alone, but in something deeper, in pride, in recognition, in the electric feeling of possibility. Across the nation, people replayed her words, sent them to friends, whispered them to themselves when cynicism threatened to take hold. And yet, as inspiring as it was, the story was not over. Because for all the courtroom drama and the soaring rhetoric, the true measure of this moment would come not in speeches, but in what happened next. Would the cracks in Mag's armor widen? Would the courage Crockett called for ripple into action? The country waited, breath held. For the answer, Crockett's lawsuit didn't just target JD Vance, it did something far bigger. It exposed the fragile core of MAGA, the cracks hiding beneath the bluster. For years they told America they were untouchable, that no one could challenge their power. But one woman, armed with nothing more than evidence, courage, and conviction, proved otherwise. She showed the nation that arrogance can be rattled, hypocrisy can be unmasked, and even the most polished mask of power can crumble under the weight of truth. And that's why this story matters beyond the courtroom. It isn't just about politics, it's about us. About whether we allow lies to define our future, or whether we demand something better. Jasmine Crockett's stand reminds us that dignity still has a place in this country, that truth still has a voice, and that courage is not just possible, it's unstoppable. So now the question becomes, what will you do with this moment? Will you let it pass as just another headline, or will you carry it forward, share it, and make sure more people know that arrogance can be defeated? If you believe dignity matters, if you believe truth still belongs in America, then join this conversation. Comment below, share this story, and subscribe so you never miss the moments that remind us who we aren't, who we refuse to become. Because in the end, Crockett's lawsuit wasn't just a challenge to JD Vance. It was a reminder to all of us that truth, when spoken with courage, is unstoppable.